Hello and welcome to the Christ and Culture Text Critical podcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto, and today we are going to be reviewing a critique of one of my most popular blog posts. So, I don't know this gentleman, but apparently someone sent it to me and was just saying, hey, just to be aware, this guy, is commenting on your stuff. I don't really care at all if people comment on my stuff. It doesn't hurt my feelings. But this was posted in the Dividing Line chat group, which I imagine I will never be invited to. So this is where this is taking place. And he says, looking for some feedback on a TR blog post I critiqued. Anybody want to play? Sure, I will play. As the author of the article, I will certainly play. He could have commented on the blog post. That would have worked if he wanted to respond to me directly. Any case. So this is the article, No, Beza was not doing modern text criticism. One of my more popular blog posts, basically responding to James White's fallacious and erroneous claim that Beza was doing exactly what the modern scholars are doing. So this is his critique. If you haven't read the article, go ahead and read it. You can type in No, Beza was not doing modern text criticism in Google, and it will be the first article that pops up for you. So part 1, he says, I'm familiar with the blog article. Cool, thanks for reading it. To be honest, I find it tiresome and inconclusive. Lots of assertions, little data, lots of assumptions, little proof. Okay, so he's asserted that I just make assertions, so let's see if his assertion is actually true. So let's see how he interacts with what I'm saying. Anyone could say, well, he's just done this and he's just done that, but you have to actually demonstrate that that's what I've done. So, number 1 is the first point that I've made, and he's quoting me. So I say, Beza approached his text critical work believing that the text had been inspired and preserved by God, end quote. So he says, that's great. Please demonstrate that CT scholars do not. You could read their words. Read Tommy Wasserman when he says that when he approaches textual criticism, he acts as though God does not exist. Read Jan Kranz, who says a similar thing. Read the actual methodology of the critical text. It is a scholarly endeavor that does not consider the Christian doctrine of Scripture in its axioms. This is not a controversial thing that I've just said. So you want to see... Let's see, he says, please demonstrate that CT scholars do not. Just ask them. Read their works. They directly say it themselves. That is not a controversial thing that I've set forth. And this is really kind of the biggest problem, I think, with the average critical text advocate, is they don't know what their own scholars say. They get their text critical information from James White and maybe D.A. Carson and John Piper and John MacArthur, and they have no idea the things their scholars are saying. So that's a problem, and I think it's coming through here. If you don't know the very basic fact that text critics approach the job of textual criticism agnostic to their religious convictions, then you don't know anything about modern textual criticism. Simple as that. So he goes on to say, disagreements over Westminster Confession of Faith 1.8 don't carry enough weight here. Well, I'm not making that argument right now, and I haven't brought it up. And in fact, Beza predates Westminster. So, not exactly sure what he's saying there. He says, judge us by our own words. Well, I'm not judging you by your own words. I mean, you might disagree with what your scholars say, but you read their product. And you say that you believe what they believe. So, if they say it, I'm judging by their words. I'm not judging you individually, but, I mean, maybe figure out what your scholars are saying before you kind of make the assertion that I'm slandering and all that. So he goes on and addresses point 2 of my article. My point 2 is, quote, Beza valued and utilized a different text platform than modern scholars value and utilize, end quote. He says, of course he did. We have more manuscript data now. Now, this is a really stupid claim. And many people say that. Yes, it is true that we have a higher count of manuscripts available to us. Interestingly enough, we only look at a little teeny portion of them. But in terms of the actual witnesses to textual variation, they were quite aware of essentially every major variant that we still discuss today. So to say that finding a manuscript, two manuscripts, without the ending of Mark would have convinced them to reject the ending of Mark is absurd. Read scholars from Beza up to John Owen and try to make that point again. The claim that we have more data today is extremely misleading because it, on one end, is true if we're counting noses. But it is not true if we are examining variation, if we are examining witnesses to variation. They were well aware of the same variants that we hotly debate today. At least, I mean, everyone that we debate today, for the most part, was being debated back then too. So, one last thing I'll comment on that. That is a response to my point. I believe it to be wrong, but it is a response. So take it for what you will. If you think that men like Turretin and John Owen and Theodore Beza and everybody who in the 16th and 17th century who defended 1 John 5:7 would have been compelled by the scraps of manuscripts we found in the 20th century. I mean, you can debate that. You can make that point. I just disagree with it. But in any case, he's only said we had better manuscript data. He's made that assertion, right? He hasn't supported it. So I guess we can just move on from that point. So he disagrees with me. He simply disagrees with me. So let's just take point 2 out of the equation, just for his benefit. So number 3, Beza took into consideration the reception of a reading by the church as a part of his text critical methodology, according to the, quote, and I quote Beza, common faith. He says, "Prove to me why this is significant when we are seeking to know what the original text was." Aha. So he agrees with me. And this comment really demonstrates that the point of the article went way over his head. When you start actually trying to debate Beza's methodology, you have now agreed that you disagree with Beza's methodology, and therefore Beza disagrees with you. So somehow the point has hit him square in the forehead, and he didn't realize it. So that's the point of the article. The article, this response would be adequate if I was saying, this is how we are to believe. But no, I'm simply saying this is what Beza did believe, and what he did believe is different what the modern scholars believe, and what they're doing and what he was doing. That's the whole purpose of the article. The purpose of the article is not to persuade you of Beza's methodology. The whole point of the article is to persuade you that what Beza was doing was different. And the fact that he's decided to pick an argument with Beza lets me know that I've done my job effectively, even if he hasn't realized it yet. So he goes on and says that it's true that the church was part of the canon process, but this ain't that. I guess supposedly channeling his inner James White there. If the Vulgate had subpar readings, should they persist after we have better ones? So we're comparing a translation to an original text. Okay, irrelevant. Why even move off the Vulgate if it controls the readings? So now he's comparing the TR with the Vulgate, which this point kind of blows my mind because the TR was a counter-papacy text. The counter-Reformation text was the Vulgate. So I really don't know how you mix up that detail in church history, but they do it quite often. In any case, it's irrelevant to what I'm saying. I just think it's interesting that when you can't respond to something, they go, Vulgate, 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 Erasmus, 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 blah, blah, blah. Like they just go down that road and don't talk about what the point is. The point is that Beza considered the common faith, and he says that's not how text criticism is done. And I say, that's the point. You missed it. So, number 4, I say that, quote, Beza utilized theology in his text critical methodology, end quote. He goes on to say, I have no idea what this means. It is so nebulous, it could mean anything. So let's look at what nebulous means and see, because I couldn't figure, I don't know off the top of my head. Hazy. I guess like a cloud. Okay, I get it now. Unclear, vague, ill-defined. So, let's get back to it. So it's hazy, nebulous. Well, it sounds much more malicious than it actually is. That's. I was thinking like something a little more evil, but no, just hazy. Okay, learned a new word today, everybody. So it is so nebulous, it could mean anything, and it certainly does not distinguish him from textual critic scholars today. Except they say that they keep their theology out of their text criticism. This is a very common, a very accepted thing that they do. They might believe in everything that Orthodox Christians believe, but they say we keep that out of our our science. That's not controversial, so I'm not sure what he's confused about. And he goes on, I think, let's see what he has to say. So he says, admitting that this is my reading and thus may be incorrect. Okay, so he admits he's incorrect. That's fine. It sounds like he's saying that Beza considered the theological significance when selecting one reading over another. Well, yeah, and I even think that's a part of, to a certain degree, the critical text, but not like, they don't consider their theology. They consider the theology of the text, right? So there's similarities there, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the theology of their bibliology is not considered when doing text criticism. They consider the theology with, Johannine theology, Johannine vocabulary. They consider that, but they don't consider their doctrine of Scripture, because then they would be perceivably biased when doing textual criticism. That was the point that I'm making. That's pretty common knowledge. That's not controversial at all, what I've said here. So he says, I can live with that if the scales are truly equal. I don't know what that means. But as with number 3, this is a text-driven process, so the text determines the theology, not the reverse. Okay, and that's my point exactly. Like, you're not arguing with me anymore. You're arguing with what I'm saying that Beza believed. And you're saying, well, Beza was wrong then. And I say, the point, turn around, it's beyond you. You missed it. It's past you. Go get it. Like, you're making my point for me. He's making my point for me. So, I mean, I guess I did a good job. I mean, if you disagree, then you have to show you disagree. Don't actually start debating the point that... Okay. All right, let's continue. So he says that it's a text-driven process, so the text determines theology, not the reverse. Okay. He goes on to say, if we find a strong reading that challenges the core of the faith, it's pretty safe to assume that it's not correct. Okay, so if you didn't catch what he just did, so first he says it's a text-driven process, right? So the text determines theology, not the reverse. But then he goes on to say that unless, of course, it affects a core doctrine, then we let theology drive the text. I mean, first of all, he's interacting beyond the point of the article at this point. He's actually getting in the nitty-gritty of the point, when my point is literally just doing a comparison. This versus that. This versus that. That's the point of my article. He's actually debating the point. And in debating the point has proved me correct. And then he goes and contradicts himself and says basically it's a text-driven process until it's not. Interesting. So then he goes on to say, Beza set apart from modernity. That's a section in the article. This section is full of slander, unsupported assertions, and meaningless posturing. He does not demonstrate that he understands the critical text arguments. Okay. Sure, let's see. Let's see if you can prove that. Let's see if you can prove that. Part 2. Are we just going to skip the part where you accuse me of slander? Guess so. I've never been a fan of numerology. Me neither. I hate numerology. I think it's wizardry. It's stupid. It's ridiculous. And I've never once written in support of biblical numerology. And so then he goes on and says, and I'd like to see how the charge of 6 verse 15 works. Bless you.
Thank you.
Of 15 works out on its own merits. I have no idea what he's talking about here. There might be something there, but even 15 ain't a lot. Oh, I guess he's talking about how many manuscripts Beza had, I suppose. Well, your Bible's based off of 2. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what he's getting at here. His bit about methodology is confusing. I'm not sure which point I'm supposed to agree with and which ones I shouldn't. I'm not trying to get you to agree with anything. I'm doing a compare and contrast. That's the genre of article that I've written for you. Bless you again. So, he says that critical text advocates may not agree with the methodology, but then does not clearly define it. He claims that no CT people are doing what Beza did. I can't follow it. So let me get this straight, gentlemen. You disagreed with Beza in your critique of me, and you don't understand how your scholars are doing differently than what Beza did. I mean, it's beyond me. It's beyond me how he's missed the point so thoroughly. But I mean, this happens. This happens all the time, I guess. So he goes on and says, another list for CT people to align with Beza and Stephanus. I have no idea what this means. And at this point, like, there's so much text here. Just write an article. Like, this is so much text. And it's so choppy, and it's hard to follow. So, like, I don't know what he's expecting people to interact with here. But I'm doing my best. So hopefully I'm at least trying to interact with what he's saying about me. So I don't know what this whole first section is, slander and all sorts of stuff. I mean, we can look at the article. Beza set apart from modernity. Look at that. Let's see if there's anything. So I talk about Beza here. That's about Beza. I quote Stephanus. Quote. Talk about the quote. Quote Beza from Jan Kranz. Do some analysis of Beza versus Erasmus. Look at a quote from Beza, or from Jan Kranz citing Beza. Talk about Beza. Okay. So I guess the only thing he might call slander is this first paragraph. So in Beza's time, there was no such notions as the initial text or the earliest extant text that scholars must attempt to reconstruct. That's true. Reconstructionist textual criticism didn't come about until, it really didn't become mainstream, at least, until the late 1800s with Westcott and Hort. There was no such notion of an evolving text or mockery of the idea that the people of God had the scriptures in total within the Reformed camp. That's true. Within the Reformed, no one was mocking someone for saying we have exactly what the prophets and apostles wrote. Now that's mocked very frequently, like even on the dividing line. These theological concepts had not yet been introduced to the church, except perhaps by the papacy and other heretical groups, of course. And that's true. That's true. You need to pee, baby?
Yeah, I'm the baby.
Okay, give me just a minute, baby. I'm almost done here. Sorry, guys. So yeah, this is true. The Reformed wrote about it all the time. And people that disagreed with the ending of Mark, 1 John 5:7, the Pericope, were all called heretics. So, I mean, like, that's not slanderous. That's historical theology. That's like, it's common knowledge if you, as this guy claims, knows his stuff. So we're going to get back to it. So I talk about the fact that the scholars don't believe in an exact original. I talk about Beza, Erasmus. There's nothing slanderous in there. But he said what I'm doing is slanderous. So I then produce a list. Let's actually see what I do here. So there's a list that I produce of 6 things. And I say, in order to support the claim that Beza and Stephanus, whose work represents what would eventually be called the received text, were doing the same thing we are today, one would have to demonstrate 6 things. So these are the things they would have to demonstrate they're doing in order to be doing the same thing as Stephanus and Beza. Okay, that's pretty fair. So I've presented my argument and said, this is what Beza was doing. This gentleman has disagreed somehow, even though that wasn't what I was doing. So he agrees with me, is what was happening. And then I say, this is what would have to be. You'd have to convince me that this is what modern critical text scholars are doing. And so I start by saying, quote, modern scholars working on the ECM are Orthodox Protestant believers, end quote. And he says, why? God could speak through the mouth of a donkey. Why does this work have to be done by believers? That's not the point. You're disagreeing with Beza. Again, proving the point of my article true. I'm not trying to convince you that this is how it should be done. I'm telling you, this is the way that Beza thought. This is the way that Beza thought. So, number 2, quote, modern scholars working on the ECM believe they have the original, end quote. Again, Beza thought he had the original. And he says, again, why is this important? That's not even a claim that CT people make. The point! It's hitting you in the forehead! It's directly hitting you in the forehead. 3, quote, modern scholars that are working on the ECM believe the Bible to be inspired by God. Again, so what? If they are Christians, they ought to hold such a doctrine, but if they are pagans, they got hired because they're good at computers. Who cares? Okay. Besides the fact that he thinks that, like, textual criticism is just working with computers, again, he's arguing, he's trying to convince me that I'm wrong, or convince Beza, I suppose, that Beza was wrong, in an article demonstrating that Beza is doing something different than he believes in. I mean, I don't think we need to go on any further, because he's going to keep doing this. He's actually been hooked by this, and he failed to miss the point so severely that he's now debating Beza. So, let's carry on. Number 4, modern scholars utilize, in part, Orthodox Protestant theology to decide on variant readings. He says, chicken and eggs. Do we get theology from the text or text from theology? Obviously, no one would accept a reading that challenges a major doctrine. There he goes with this big contradiction again. The text drives it until it doesn't. Okay? He's still arguing with Beza, though. 5, quote, modern scholars consult the common faith of the Christian religion in their methodology. He says, got any definitions to go with them fancy Larnin words? I don't know, I just was quoting Beza. Like, take it up with Beza, man. 6, quote, modern scholars value the readings historically received by the church when deciding on a variant, end quote. He says they do, but that's not the only factor considered when evaluating the best reading in any certain text. They do? Where in the text critical methodology do they do this? They don't. It's not a part of their axioms. It's not. This list is useless. Well, sir, I am offended, sir. It's an extrapolation from the author's imagination about what made Beza special and what would be impossible for modern folks to comply with. Well, there we go. And it would be impossible for modern folks to comply with. The point, my sir. The point, my sir. It's on your forehead. It's hit you. It's barrowing into your forehead. Everyone can see it. I'm not sure whether to call it special pleading, unfair scales, or just plain dumb. Sir, do not throw rocks in glass houses. So now part 3. And now we proceed to quote someone. Googling his name does not give the same bio as the blog does, out of context, but without allowing that there may be more charitable understanding of the statements. Nope, he is verboten, the boogeyman, scary. The conclusion continues to misrepresent or misunderstand Parker. As in DC Parker? The man who wrote the living text of... Okay. The conclusion continues to misrepresent or misunderstand Parker. He says, quote, I say that to highlight the reality that the methodology being employed is not the same as been employed throughout the ages, and it's hard to believe that many Reformed believers would approve of the methodology if they understood it better. Yeah, I still stand by that statement. Neither methodology has actually been described or distinguished in this blog post. Okay, here's a point. The assumption of this blog post is that if you're reading it, you have a good understanding of modern textual criticism. That you understand who D.C. Parker is, that you understand what your own scholars say, which clearly this gentleman does not. I don't need to write a book on text criticism for you to get to the point of my article. The assumption is that you're already there. And if you read the rest of my blog, I've already done that work. So I really, really think that the standard of like, you have to provide perfect definitions before you say anything. It's like, I'm not going to describe what modern textual criticism is to someone who claims to know what it teaches, which this gentleman clearly does not. So he goes on to say, neither methodology has been described or distinguished in this blog post, except I provided 4 points. 4 points from Jan Kranz. 4 points of distinguishing features. 4 points. 4 points. 4 points. That's 4 times you got hit in the forehead. 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom. And missed the point. He goes on to quote me and says, the quote, the work of Beza was the work of a faithful Christian and a brilliant scholar. He used the manuscripts with which the people of God consented to and consulted many scholars and theologians in the process, end quote. That sounds an awful like CT. And well, and then in the article actually lists like 20 scholars that he consulted. And his response, where I provide a distinguishing feature of Beza, he says, just saying that sounds an awful lot like CT. What? No. He goes on to quote me again. Almost always the arguments offered for the modern critical text are simply attacks on the received text, end quotes. He says, this is false. Except in the response, he compares the TR to the Vulgate. In this response, he does it. He does it. Boom, 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 boom. I don't get it. I do not understand the way that these people's brains work. It is so, I mean, I understand, I understand why they believe in the critical text. Like, in his critique of my article, he compares the TR to the Bible of the papacy, the Vulgate. And my point is, almost always, the only arguments offered for the modern critical text are simply attacks on the received text. I mean, we can talk about transmission and compilation for hours without ever once mentioning the TR. Can you do this? What? The only reality in which the Bible is... He quotes me again. The only reality in which the Bible is preserved is the reality that the textual efforts of the Reformation period were faithful efforts of men that God used to distribute his Bible to the preserved word to the world. End quote. That was me. Still stand by it. Still believe it. He sounds great. Prove it. That's a big claim. Well, that's what happened. Like, pick another Bible. Like, was there a critical text Bible that existed, that everyone read and used and translated from for hundreds of years? That's not a controversial claim. I mean, even his own scholars say it's the default text. Like, how does something become a default text if what I just said isn't true? Ought to be a lot of biblical data to support it. Yes, thousands upon thousands of manuscripts that your scholars choose to believe are evolutions of an earlier text. So, I at this point, I mean, I feel like it's just gonna, yeah. I mean, he's going on and on and on. He's not actually refuting anything that I've said. Yeah, so I could carry on, but I feel like it might just get a little bit mean at this point. So, yeah, with that, we'll call an end to this video. But I mean, really, in summary, I think the biggest takeaway is that this gentleman actually thought that he was refuting my article when he was actually proving my point by saying that Beza was wrong. So if you thought that Beza was doing the same thing as your scholars, but you think that Beza was wrong, then either you think your scholars are wrong, or you're admitting they're doing something different. That was the persuasive point of my article. Apparently, there's some layer of this gentleman's brain that understands that, but I think he's missed the point. You can disagree with Beza, you can disagree with me. That wasn't what I was doing. I was presenting, according to Jan Kranz, Beza's text critical methodology, putting it up against the modern critical text methodology, and just doing a compare and contrast. And then I end the article by saying, if you want to say that Beza was doing what you're doing, or that the modern scholars were doing what Beza was doing, they would have had to be doing these things, which they aren't. And no scholar says that they're doing those things. No text criticism book says they're doing those things. So, I mean, that's pretty much it. So this is the kind of argumentation you're going to see out there, you guys. In any case, this is your host, Taylor DeSoto, with the Christ and Culture Text Criticism blog. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and until next time, we will see you later. Thanks for watching.